This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream, a subscription streaming service that offers over 2,000 documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. You can get unlimited access starting at just $2.99 a month. And just for our audience, the first 30 days are completely free if you sign up at curiositystream.com/brainfood and use the promo code BRAINFOOD, all one word, no uppercase, just all lowercase, no quotes during the sign-up process. If you're looking for a specific recommendation on the platform, then why not check out something that I recently watched, which is Pluto Beyond the Flyby, which looks at what we've learned from the planet since the flyby of the New Horizons spacecraft. It's a solid watch, really enjoyable stuff, and you can do that in your free trial if you want to, but there's also loads of other great stuff to watch as well if that doesn't appeal to you. CuriosityStream is also available on many platforms. You can watch it in a web app on your Roku, Android, Xbox One, Smart TV, iOS, Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Amazon Kindle, and Apple TV. And it's also available worldwide. Go to curiositystream.com/brainfood for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And for our listeners, as I said, enter the code BRAINFOOD when prompted during the sign-up process, and your membership is completely free for 30 days. And let's get into it, because today we are answering a viewer question because Jeremy asks us, if I'm drunk and can't drive, could I legally ride my horse home instead? To begin with, in the vast majority of countries on Earth, driving under the influence is usually defined as operating a vehicle after imbibing an alcoholic beverage or drug to the extent that your mental faculties are impaired. So, given nobody in day-to-day speech would call a horse a vehicle, you might think you can't possibly get cited for driving under the influence when riding a horse. But let's dig a little deeper, because it turns out drinking and driving laws do indeed apply to horses in some cases. If you think that's a little bizarre, well, just wait until the bonus fact later on when we'll discuss the illegality of driving after you eat at Olive Garden in some countries. In any event, as with seemingly everything to do with the law, the answer to this question is complicated, and it varies not just by country, but sometimes within countries and within the US by state. With that caveat out of the way, for the easy answer, if the horse is pulling a cart, then almost universally, yes, the horse and buggy combo counts as a vehicle. This is because in most regions, almost anything with wheels on the road is considered a vehicle, outside of some exceptions like wheelchairs, or in a few regions where a motor is explicitly required for something to be defined as a vehicle. Thus, with exceptions like Montana, whose definition of vehicle explicitly notes except drivers moved by animal power, if you're riding or driving a horse that is pulling some sort of cart on the road, you can potentially be cited for driving under the influence. For example, in December of 2009 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, police pulled over a 22-year-old Amish man, Elmer Stoltzfus, who was operating a horse-drawn buggy on a public roadway while drunk. Although operating is too strong of a word here, as the man was actually just slumped over, asleep in the buggy at the time, with the horse seemingly knowing the way home and taking him along for the ride. When Stoltzfus was subjected to a breathalyzer test, he had a blood alcohol level of 0.18, slightly over twice the legal limit. But what about if there is no cart? And we'll start with an easy one, and that applies to the US and the UK, where it is indeed illegal to ride a horse while intoxicated. This is thanks to the Licensing Act of 1872, which among other things states every person who is drunk while in charge on any highway or other public place of any carriage, horse, cattle, or steam engine shall be liable to a penalty not exceeding 40 shillings, or in the discretion of the court to imprisonment for any term not exceeding 1 month. As breathalyzers were not a thing back then, this law does not specify any precise level of intoxication needed, leaving it to the officer's discretion. Now, if you, like us, wondered if this rather old and obscure law is still ever enforced, it turns out, well, yes it is. For example, in January of 2009, a very drunk 31-year-old Godfrey Blacklin was riding a horse named Bart bareback in Newcastle. When the obviously intoxicated man couldn't even write down his address for the officers, despite claiming he'd only had a couple of cans, He was subsequently taken into custody and charged under said 1872 Act. Rather than 40 shillings, however, his fine was £150 plus an additional £35 levied for justice of the peace costs. Moving over to the United States, this varies from state to state, but many states classify horses as vehicles when on the road. This is done in a few different ways, sometimes explicitly in the original wording of the laws and defining of vehicle, other times via court cases where precedent has been established to help define that term, or in some cases having other traffic laws that directly deal with riding horses while intoxicated, separate from any definition of vehicle. States that have such prohibitions on riding a horse while intoxicated include North Carolina, Kansas, Michigan, Florida, Oregon, and California, as well as a few others. Colorado is another state that very specifically prohibits riding horses while intoxicated, but in this case considers this a simple traffic violation rather than the more serious consequences that can be had from being charged with driving under the influence. That said, there are several states such as Tennessee, Wisconsin, Texas, Washington State, New Jersey, and Montana that have no such rules, and it is entirely possible to ride a horse home from the bar after getting rather tipsy, and you'll not technically be able to be cited for driving under the influence. Interestingly, in the case of New Jersey in 1898, there was a law on the books prohibiting driving of any horse, mule, or other beast of burden while under the influence of intoxicating liquor. This law, however, it was repealed in 1971. All of this being said, it should be noted that even in these regions, there are several other laws a zealous officer could still get you for, including even animal cruelty, as you are drunkenly controlling a horse on a public roadway, potentially with cars around, and thus can be deemed to be placing the animal at significant risk. Other potential laws you could be considered to be violating include public endangerment due to reckless behavior, child endangerment if you're riding the horse near children or have one along for the ride on the horse, and other things like that. More likely, you'll just be cited for public intoxication, such as what happened on the 13th of January 2011 to two Texan men, Samuel Olivo and Jose Rios. In this case, the men were charged with driving while intoxicated when they were seen riding a horse and a mule, respectively, through Austin. At the same time, they were also drunkenly attempting to get people to take pictures with them. Not just a little trousered. In the case of Jose, he was so drunk, the officer attempting to administer the breathalyzer test found him incapable of completing the test. Jose later needed to be hospitalized for alcohol poisoning. That said, despite the extreme level of intoxication, as alluded to, Texas is one of those states that stresses the motorized vehicle part rather than the more general vehicle. Thus, while the two men were initially charged for driving while intoxicated, this was later dropped and switched to a charge of public intoxication. In yet another case of this, one Jake Williams of Louisiana hadn't initially planned to ride his horse Sugar home, simply having him in his horse trailer at the time. But after getting properly medicated at the bar, he decided he was too intoxicated to drive home, so he got his horse out of the trailer and attempted to ride it home, later stating his reasoning as, "When you get a little too much to drink, why not ride a horse? It's safer that way. The horse knows the way home." Unfortunately for him, someone saw him leave the bar and mount the horse and called the cops on him. When the police found that he was indeed quite drunk, they couldn't charge him under drunk driving laws of Louisiana, so simply cited him for public intoxication. But to sum up, it is technically illegal in many regions of the world to ride a horse while drunk. However, when a random citizen isn't calling the cops on you, and if you don't appear to be doing anything unsafe or harassing anyone, even in regions where you can be charged with drunk driving if riding a horse while intoxicated, it would seem from the countless accounts we found of people doing this without any consequence to themselves, particularly in the UK, that it's unlikely an officer would really do anything at all. After all, the police aren't exactly typically on the lookout for people riding horses while drunk. So indeed, you'd have to make it pretty obvious to them in most cases, or be doing something else illegal to draw their attention. And now for a bonus fact. The point at which a person is considered to be having their faculties impaired enough to make driving unsafe varies considerably from place to place, with some nations even going so far as having a 0% threshold. Interestingly, as with pretty much all zero-tolerance policies, this is rather absurd, as eating a large quantity of bready foods will, in many people, result in a negligible but nonetheless measurable amount of alcohol in the bloodstream, thanks to certain yeasts in your gut producing some alcohol as they help process what you've just consumed. In extreme and very rare cases, this can even result in fully fledged auto-brewery syndrome, which sees the person in question getting perpetually drunk after eating many foods until the offending yeast is mostly eliminated and normal gut microbial colonies and densities can be re-established. The point being, if you happen to live in a nation that has a 0% threshold, it's technically illegal to go to the Olive Garden and then drive home. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Also, our sponsors make this daily channel possible. Today's sponsor is CuriosityStream. If you want to be an amazing person and you think that unlimited free documentaries could be for you, go check out CuriosityStream. There is a link below. You get 30 days for free. And as always, thank you for watching.